There are plenty of forgotten mascots from the 1990s, names that flicker briefly in memory before disappearing again. But very few went from everywhere to nowhere, quite like Earthworm Jim. One moment he's being crowned the best new character in gaming, the next he's got a cartoon, toys, comics, and a fanbase that couldn't get enough of his bizarre charm. And then, silence. No long goodbye, no dignified fade, just a hard stop. So what happened? How does a character go from industry darling in 1994 to effectively gone by 1999? Let's wind the clock back to the early 1990s. The games industry wasn't just competing on technology, it was competing on personality, and mascots were the currency. You had Sonic the Hedgehog blazing through levels with attitude, and Mario calmly dominating everything else. Everyone wanted their own equivalent, their own icon. And into that environment steps an unlikely contender. Playmates Toys, a company known for action figures rather than game design, saw the opportunity. Creating a mascot wasn't optional, it was essential, so they funded a new studio called Shiny Entertainment and brought in animator Doug TenNapel. He came up with something that doesn't sound like a winning idea. An earthworm, in a spacesuit, with the worm itself acting as the head. It's not heroic, it's not cool in the traditional sense, it's slightly ridiculous, which, as it turns out, was exactly the point. At a time when everyone was trying to be sleek and marketable, this leaned into the opposite. Something awkward, something strange, something you couldn't quite categorise. That something was Earthworm Jim, and somehow, against all logic, it worked. By 1994, development was underway at Shiny Entertainment, led by David Perry. On paper, it's chaos. You're platforming 1 minute, underwater the next, then suddenly escorting a fragile character or launching cows into the sky for no clear reason. It sounds like a lack of direction, but when you play it, it feels deliberate. Every level introduces something new, every moment keeps you guessing, and then there's the animation. This is where Earthworm Jim separates itself from the pack. Characters stretch, squash, snap and recoil with a fluidity that feels closer to hand-drawn cartoons than typical 16-bit games. Jim doesn't just move, he performs. Add in the humour, which leans into absurdity rather than punchlines, and you get something that stands out immediately. The result? A hit. Not just commercially, but culturally within gaming. Earthworm Jim was voted Best New Character of the Year. For a character that shouldn't have worked, that's quite the entrance. In 1995, Earthworm Jim 2 arrives. Instead of playing it safe, it doubles down. The level design becomes even more unhinged. Gameplay styles shift more dramatically. The humour becomes stranger, not safer. It's a risky move, but it pays off. Many still consider it the stronger of the two games. At this point, Jim isn't just a success story, he's a franchise, and in the mid-90s, that means expansion. By the middle of the decade, Earthworm Jim is everywhere. There's an animated series, which leans fully into the surreal tone of the games. There are action figures, comics, and merchandise lining the shelves. For a brief period, Jim stands shoulder to shoulder with the era's defining mascots. It's not just success, it's saturation. And this is usually where things start to wobble, because once you're everywhere, maintaining that presence becomes the real challenge. Around 1996, the ground begins to move. Not gradually, suddenly. The arrival of 3D gaming doesn't just add a new dimension, it changes expectations entirely. Games like Super Mario 64 don't feel like evolution, they feel like a reset. 2D platformers, once dominant, start to look like relics almost overnight. Earthworm Jim, for all its creativity, is rooted firmly in that 2D space. Attempts are made to keep the character relevant, ports, re-releases, adaptations, but something subtle begins to slip. The impact isn't quite the same. The unpredictability that once felt fresh now has to compete with entirely new ways of playing. Before Jim steps into a new dimension, he shrinks and finds himself on the Game Boy Color. And this is where the cracks become easier to see. The original games relied heavily on expressive animation and visual personality. That's difficult to preserve on a smaller screen with less power. So while the structure remains, the energy fades, the humour lands less often, the movement feels stiffer, the identity, once so distinctive, starts to blur. It's not a complete failure, but it's not enough to reignite interest either. If anything, it exposes a key weakness. Earthworm Jim only works when everything is firing together. Strip away too much, and the whole thing starts to feel ordinary. And ordinary was never the selling point. By 1999, Jim makes the jump to the Nintendo 64. Earthworm Jim 3D is meant to be the reinvention, the statement that the character can survive in this new era. Instead, it becomes a turning point. The humour is still present, the tone is recognisable, but the execution falters. Controls lack precision, level design feels unfocused, the pacing drifts. What once felt like controlled chaos now feels loose. And then there's a bigger problem. By the time it arrived, the bar had already been set. 3D platformers have found their footing. Expectations are higher. Players demand tighter design, clearer structure, more refinement. And unfortunately, Earthworm Jim 3D just didn't meet that standard. The reception is mixed, and in a market that has moved on, a mixed reception isn't survivable. At this point, the decline isn't just about one game, it's structural. Key creatives begin drifting away. Among them, TenNapel becomes less directly involved, studios shift direction, and the priorities change. Without a clear voice guiding it, the franchise loses cohesion. This isn't a dramatic collapse, it's quieter than that, more like erosion. Bit by bit, the identity that made Earthworm Jim stand out begins to wear down. And then, almost without ceremony, it stops. No major releases follow, no sustained push to revive the character, just a gradual disappearance. For something that once felt unavoidable, the absence is striking. Which brings us back to the question at the start: how does something so prominent vanish so completely? Timing plays a role, technology plays a role, but the core issue is simpler. Earthworm Jim was built on unpredictability, precision, and tightly controlled chaos. That combination thrived in 2D. In 3D, and in scaled-down formats, it became harder to manage. And once that balance slipped, so did everything else. Despite everything, Earthworm Jim isn't entirely forgotten. The original games still hold a place in conversation. They're remembered for their animation, their humour, and their willingness to be different. In a decade obsessed with being cool, Jim chose to be strange, and for a while, that made him stand out more than anything else on the shelf. Jim today now exists in a kind of limbo, not gone, but not quite alive either. Earthworm Jim didn't collapse because the idea was flawed. It collapsed because the conditions that made it work disappeared. In 1994, it was exactly what the industry needed. By 1999, that industry needed something else, and Earthworm Jim couldn't adapt quickly enough. So what you're left with is a story that's both impressive and abrupt. A strange idea that became a phenomenon. a rapid climb to the top, and a fall that came just as quickly. Not with spectacle, but with silence. And perhaps that's the most fitting ending of all, because Earthworm Jim was never predictable, not even in the way it disappeared.